Hello from Jerusalem. This is Powers in Play. Our topic today, unity or opportunity. And here we are unified. We have two Irans, one Danny and one Doron. And welcome Colonel, retired, and Dr. Eran Lerman, Brigadier General in the reserves, Doron Gavish, Eran Etzion, and Danny Ayalon, all with significant resumes we won't go over right now. Perhaps if you behave correctly, we will mention some of your achievements. Over the last 3 months, obviously, the Russia-Ukraine war is in the headlines, and the law of unintended consequences caused us to focus on what happens when a Putin finds a pretext in preempting Ukraine joining NATO, thereby bringing Sweden and Finland to the doorstep of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But because the alliance has 30 members and is working by consensus, each member must give their agreement, and Turkey is obviously using it in order to either torpedo the joining the alliance or exact some price for its consent. So the question, first of all, for you, General Gavish, you have been not only in a semi-diplomatic position as the head of the Defense Ministry's mission in Europe, in Western Europe, but you are also in touch with your American colleagues when they joined the Israeli Defense Forces on exercises. And the question, first of all, is whether a military collaboration and cooperation agreement exists within a political framework in such a way that the professionals can do their job regardless of what the politicians tell them to.
First of all, at the end of the day, the military, they have to do what they have been told by those politicians. And so it's not that there is a huge distinction between the two entities. But in general, of course, when you're on the military part, on the operational part, I would say, you're trying to be very focused on your target. You're trying to be very focused on your mission, and to look at it from a professional point of view. You would have the political framework, and you would work under it. So I think that from this point of view, when it comes to militaries and to the professional discussion between them or among them, it's in a way easier because militaries are talking professional issues. They are talking about how do we defend, what is the context, what is the concept in those things, but very professionally. So I think that also, in this situation within NATO and within the different parties, when it comes to the military point of view, it's much easier because politics, they are part of it, but they are less, I would say, influencing the day-by-day mission or preparing themselves to the mission.
Dr. Lerman, you're a veteran military intelligence officer and national security staff official. And obviously, when we look at NATO, there is the French case whereby General de Gaulle took the French military out of the alliance, kicked the headquarters from Paris to Brussels, but stayed on as a political partner. Is it possible to be halfway in and halfway out?
Well, clearly the French managed it somehow, although they were trying to play a triangulation game between West and East to some extent. Essentially, they never forgave the Americans for what they saw as a betrayal of French interests in Southeast Asia and in Algeria and in the Egyptian crisis of '56. So they felt they needed...
I thought they never forgave the Americans for saving them in World War II.
Well, that's a nastier way of putting the same thing. But the result was a hybrid reality, which increasingly became difficult for the French to sustain. And within 20 years, it was they retrieved their position as military participants. And there's a lot to be gained for Israel as well from the daily interaction with a highly sophisticated military organization such as NATO and some key members of NATO. At the same time, the obligation to actually, the so-called Chapter 5 obligation.
Article 5.
Article 5 obligation to come to the aid of others in a war is not a proposition that Israel wants to commit to. And it's for this reason also that all these years Israel has shied away from a formal treaty of alliance with the United States, even at the bilateral level. We are allies. We are defined as a major non-NATO ally, like many others. We are defined as a special partner and ally as a unique category, but we are not formally obliged to send Israeli troops to fight alongside the United States. And I think this is a healthy distinction. We draw benefits from this work with an alliance. We actually contribute significantly in intelligence, in technology, in operation solutions to challenges, desert warfare, IEDs, whatever we could bring to the table. But it is healthier not to commit to Article 5.
Eran Etzion, you too have been at the National Security Staff and in other government functions. You've seen politicians, decision makers from up close. Mm-hmm. How do they weigh the loss of partial sovereignty vis-a-vis what Israel would gain from being backed by a multi-member alliance?
Actually, from what I experienced, and I was involved in various iterations of discussions, both with the Americans and with the Europeans, to a certain extent with NATO as well, about possible closer association between those entities in Israel. I think the problem was always twofold, and it had less to do with the politicians than actually with the military echelons and with the actual geopolitical facts. By the latter, I mean the fact that Israel does not have internationally recognized borders. Therefore, Article 5 cannot be applied under any circumstances unless and until Israel reaches an agreement with all of its neighbors about all of its borders. And we're the only country, with the exception of Pakistan, that doesn't have a single continuous internationally recognized border, not even with Egypt, not even with Jordan. So that's number one, and that was the critical fact from both sides, both our counterparts and from our own strategic side.
Which goes back to what President Johnson told Prime Minister Eshkol when they met at the LBJ Ranch in early 1968. When you ask for assistance to Israel, what is this Israel that you're talking about, pre-67 or with the occupied territories?
It's like Arik Sharon on the right and the left hand, yes. So that was the first geopolitical fact. And the second is the staunch antagonism by the IDF and the entire military establishment, the defense establishment, to any quote-unquote infringement on their own freedom of decision and freedom of maneuver that would invariably be affected by such an alliance. And it was more, again, from the professionals than the politicians. I always found it wrong, to put it succinctly. And I think to a certain extent, we do not enjoy the kind of freedom to maneuver that we illude ourselves to believe that we do, number one. And number two, when you weigh, and of course this is a very complicated calculation, but when you try to weigh all the pros and all the cons for an alignment, a strategic agreement, a strategic alliance between Israel and the US or Israel and NATO, with the counter-arguments, I think the advantages far outweigh the disadvantages. But of course, it's a discussion that will be ongoing for many years.
But of course, everyone wants to get and not to give. This is natural and political.
Negotiations, this is about negotiations.
Danny Ayalon, you've served in Israel's top diplomatic position as ambassador to Washington and also as deputy foreign minister. You're a great friend of the Republic of Turkey. Turkey,
And Greece.
yes, and Greece, of course.
I'm a national hero in Greece, by the way.
You are.
I'm sure.
Yes, I've seen statues of yourself on a horse there.
In the Parthenon, yeah.
Now, Turkey is now playing a very interesting game. There are, as we know, 30 member states of NATO. There are those formerly members of the Warsaw Pact, such as Bulgaria, which perhaps Russia can put pressure on to torpedo the accession of Finland and Sweden. But Turkey, of all countries, with its history regarding Russia, with the Black Sea, with everything we know, the S-400 and the F-35, Turkey is now threatening to block the deal. How much of it is only bargaining, and how much of it is real?
Well, looking into Turkey's geopolitical landscape today, I believe that the position that they take is mostly opportunistic for a bargaining chip. I don't think that Turkey can afford itself to really go, all the way out against the alliance, against the United States, when they are also very much exposed vis-a-vis the Russians. So the Turks, I guess, like Turks, will negotiate, and I think if they get few things that they want vis-a-vis the PKK and and a few other things, maybe even economic aid, I don't think that they will go all the way, because if they overplay their hand, although there is no protocol or an official way to dislodge them from NATO de facto, that could happen, and they will find themselves in a very, very dire straits. I believe that I'm not sure about Erdogan, because he has proven himself to be, when he needed to, quite rational, but also the people around him, I think, and especially as they are approaching an election soon, I don't think that Erdogan, from political reasons, will want to be in a direct confrontation with the entire alliance. So I believe it's just an opening salvo position, and they will come to terms.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently talked with his new French counterpart, which, interestingly enough, the title there is Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, because Europe is not foreign affairs. Being
it is.
a member and leader of the EU, France does not consider European relations as part of foreign affairs. He asked
Europe is
her,
not foreign to them.
yes. So he asked her to help with the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, even though this is EU business too. So how do you relate these two organizations in this crisis?
By the way, with the Turks, it will be very meager help. The relationship between Paris and Ankara reached
All-time low.
rock bottom in recent years. The French have come openly in support of the Greek and the Cypriot position on questions such
But we've known Erdogan to change his mind.
Erdogan is definitely obliged to change. By the way, I think the core story here is about the significant presence of Kurdish nationalists in Finland and Sweden. The names are known, and the Turks will have to find a way to basically climb down while saving face. But the French position is clearly in support now of a very robust Europe. The problem is, again, by and large, the problem again is Turkey for another reason. And the communications between what I sometimes call the BBBs, big Brussels bureaucracies, the one downtown, the EU, and the one uphill in NATO, have been almost minimal. because of the Cypriot question. Turkey is a member of NATO, but not a member of the EU. Greek Cyprus, or what the Turks dismissively call the Greek area of Cyprus, is a member of good standing of the EU, but not a member of NATO. And over this question, over the years, it was very difficult to coordinate policy between these two institutions. This has given rise to some attempts to create a European military non-dependent on NATO, but that is...
Maybe Israel could mediate between them the way Bennett has mediated between Zelensky and Putin.
We certainly have a profound interest in seeing the Cyprus question resolved for many reasons.
Energy.
Finding a rational delineation of the EEZs in the Eastern Mediterranean to the satisfaction.
And we are against holding on to occupied territories.
Well, we are against
settling them.
We are against the idea of the return of massive refugee populations after long wars. The long and the short of it is Turkey is a key player in this respect as well, and a problematic one. For years, there was a murmur in NATO that maybe a way should be found, since there's no, in the Statute of 49, there's no provision for throwing out a member. But there are ways of structuring the internal power dynamics so that some members stay on the first floor and others...
More equal than others.
Others are more equal than others. Turkey can no longer afford to be relegated to that position with a growling bear to the north of it. So I think that at the end of the day, they will have to find a compromise.
So just a comment, it's interesting that what Turkey is now demanding of the Nordic countries, that is expulsion of the PKK members, is what Israel demands of Turkey regarding the Hamas members residing in it and operating against Israel. General Gavish, regarding the military benefits as well as the costs, we know that Finland is going to add an 800-mile border for NATO with Russia. This is going to be a burden for Russia, but also for the alliance if it wants to position forces in Finland. So, on balance, is it a plus or a minus for NATO?
For NATO, of course, from a military point of view, it's a big plus. It's a, from the intelligence point of view, if we're talking about those obvious things, even before deploying systems over there, there is a huge advantage there, being there, being on the border. And of course, it is an advantage from the point of view that if you would have to, we hope we won't get there, but in a war with Russia, of course, you have another flank that you could react from. So the answer is yes. I mean, it's definitely an advantage from a military point of view from NATO. But I also would like to remark on what was saying. I completely agree with, looking on Erdogan, also his behavior toward Israel. I mean, we've been, as you said, same as with France, it was the same with us. And he found a way, in a very pragmatic way, to see how does he behave differently and what could he gain from it, and also from the military point of view. This is also an advantage that he could use this bargaining position for having some maybe military equipment from the United States that he needs for his Air Force, for example. So, I also believe that it's a pragmatic way of thinking, and we'll find a way.
But General, you've been in charge of Israel's air defense.
Air and missile defense.
Yes, okay, not the air superiority interceptors that the Air Force employs. The Russians have reminded the Finns and the Swedes ominously that they have missiles in Kaliningrad. And therefore, this could probably mean some new defense for these new members of NATO. So again, the United States will have to supply them an added cost, while all of those NATO members, old and new, are asked to at least budget 2% of their budgets for defense.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and probably ballistic missile defense is one of the first military means that countries today in Europe are looking at. We see what is happening in Germany now, for example, but for sure in Finland and Sweden, and you know, I've been in a conference, I think it was back in 2014, about the ballistic missile defense of Europe and NATO, and it was already there. I mean, they understood this is something that they would need. Now I think there is not a question.
But all Western powers made sure that the Russians know that these defenses are against the North Koreans and the Iranians and not against them, because this will destabilize arms control agreements.
You're right, but then from this, from the other end, we see even today there is a U.S. deployment to Poland, so it's there and it's happening. You're right that in a different situation, when it was calm, then when you bring in defense systems, then it applies that you want to do something. But during a conflict, we see that it happens. So I think that going back to your question, yes, it's a big advantage, and probably the ballistic missile defense will be one of the main issues that they would have to discuss.
A question for both of you, Eran and Danny. The alliance is a coalition of 30 states, but most governments of member states are also coalitions. So it's a domestic issue in addition to being a foreign policy and national security one. Is that a problem? And the question goes two ways. One, regarding decision-making in a coalition government, and then, in a democracy at least, there is the possibility that the government will change. One government commits itself to this new move, and of course there is continuity in foreign policy, but the next government could be against it. If we take an extreme example, President Trump and the JCPOA, Netanyahu helping Trump revoke American participation in it, and so on and so forth.
Well, it's an age-old question. It's not going to change.
I thought I invented it.
If we can try and kind of pick and choose some of the new elements in the equation, I would enumerate the following. Number one, the role of public opinion is very different in the age of social networks. And what we're seeing now, for example, in Finland and Sweden, is an really an astonishing speed of a drastic policy change of historic dimensions, 200, 300 years of neutrality overturned overnight, mainly because of bottom-up pressures from the public. So, if you will, the power relations between the peoples and their governments has transformed fundamentally and continues to transform.
Thanks to Putin. One man caused this change.
Yes, but if under different circumstances, a few years ago, the dynamics would have been different. I mean, it would have taken much longer, and it would have been different. And as you correctly say, it could turn back or turn into a different direction as quickly as it did this time. So you're absolutely right that the level of volatility is much higher. And you're also right to point out Trump and the US and Trump's foreign policy vis-a-vis not only Iran, but also NATO. We remember just a couple of years ago, Angela Merkel saying that, completely in shock, that for the first time, the Europeans can no longer trust the US to fulfill Article 5. And this could very well reincarnate if Trump is reelected. And it doesn't even have to be Trump. Now that the GOP is completely ruled by Trumpism, whoever is elected from that side of the American aisle could just as easily go back on any kind of commitment by the Americans. And that, of course, goes very deep into the calculations of the Europeans. It is burnt in their collective
1919 all over again.
Yeah.
The Republican-led Senate refusing to ratify the League of Nations.
And the last thing I would say in terms of transformations is, and that is due to Putin and his invasion of Ukraine, that the collective understanding or collective consciousness of the Europeans when it comes to defense affairs and to their own national securities and even personal securities has been transformed fundamentally, and this is irreversible. I mean, I remember discussions with some of my Polish colleagues years ago, and they were trying to convince me that there is still a very strategic Russian threat on Poland, and I would try not to laugh in their faces. But they were right. And I think this is now true for every European, and it's not going to go away regardless of the final outcomes of the war in Ukraine. And that is a sea change.
What's your view, Danny? You've been the number 2 man at the foreign ministry when the minister was Avigdor Lieberman, a Moldovan by birth, when Moldova was part of the Soviet Union. Was that, by the way, any factor, the personal experience?
Well, there was certainly some affinity and some sympathy towards Moldova by Lieberman and the Eastern Bloc. You can see it not just in the different declarations, but also you see where you go, where you put your foot or your money in, and most of his trips were.
He put his money or took? Well,
by the way,
somebody's money.
To my chagrin, he was the only Western foreign minister back in 2012 when Putin returned to power. He went specifically to Moscow and sat with him and vouched for a free and fair elections, when everybody else said how distorted and fake it was. So yes, personal, of course, personal, I would say, persuasion has something to do with it. But I would say that I agree with Iran about, where the NATO coalitions within coalitions may go. It can go every which way. But in the case of Israel, I think there is a culture of not trusting alliances, certainly not the international community, and I think we have a good reason why, it's not surprising. And there's also a tradition of going it alone. So in that respect, I think it is very deep down in terms of culture, not just among the military, but also the political echelon. And it would be interesting to take, I don't know if there have been any recent polls taken, but Israelis have been stung many, many times by the international community, whether the UNEP in 1967, which was supposed to
but
guard.
It worked for 10 years.
It worked for 10 years, right? But we are here thinking hundreds of years from now.
But why do you bring up public opinion polls? Is the public going to vote according to such an issue? Are the politicians going to be affected by what the public thinks?
I'll tell you from my perspective in the different discussions I've been involved in, including in Washington. It seems like the best of all, I would say, contingencies for Israel is not to belong formally into a coalition, but to link itself very, very strongly with a superpower, namely the United States. As long as the United States has this ironclad commitment for Israel's security and well-being, we take it less, I would say, importantly.
Iron, I-R-O-N, not I-R-A-N. Let me tie in this question and address it to both of you. We should, at least in this part of the program, turn Jerusalem-centric and ask the age-old, as you said, question, what's in it for us? So diplomatically, strategically, Iran, and then militarily, Iran.
Well, on the positive side of the ledger, Israel formally joining an alliance, which almost naturally would be NATO. We have been in dialogue with NATO, Mediterranean, and made a dialogue with NATO now for the better part of 20 years. Would signal to all our neighbors that we are here to stay. Israel, as President Obama once said, Israel is not going anywhere. And that the strategy of isolation has failed, and that our position is not just hanging by the thread of American policy, but it is part of a broader alignment and forces, and there is a commitment to Israel's survival by a very important bloc of nations. But at the end of the day, the other side of the equation is that much of this is already there without the formal obligation to come to our defense. And the negatives in this respect are, first of all, the sense that subjecting the IDF to NATO authority would have severe consequences on our freedom of action. There are certain aspects of the Israeli defense posture that we don't even want to discuss, and we are under obligation to our American and French friends never to discuss. And so it will only complicate matters. And moreover, that given our precarious situation, and given that the IDF is based on the draft, we cannot commit to sending significant forces abroad to fight alongside others in a NATO mission in Afghanistan, for example. So and the same has been true for many years also on the very important question of a bilateral alliance. So at least from my point of view, I believe that the negatives still outweigh the positives, certainly as long as Israel is able, without going into alliance, is now able to place itself in alignment, which is a different term. It signifies what they call like-mindedness. It signifies cooperation, sharing of intelligence, sharing of purposes, coordination under certain scenarios, but without the formal commitment. And when the Indians are talking about a Western Quad, which will include the US, India, the UAE, and Israel, when the UAE, Israel, Greece, and Cyprus sit in the Paphos Forum, when Israel has a semi-formal relationship with NATO that does not involve an alliance, when we have this Eastern Mediterranean position, which again does not oblige us to send forces to defend Cyprus in a war or Greece in a war, or vice versa, but generates a sense among the potential common adversaries that we are together. That serves the purpose
The first case was when Israel was part of the FBI, the French-British-Israeli invasion of Egypt in 1956.
That was so fragile that Ben-Gurion insisted on taking the Sevres agreement in his pocket so that the British would not betray us and say that this was unprovoked.
But they tried to anyway.
Yes.
General?
Before answering, I must go back to that point that was made by Danny.
Your wish is our command.
Thank you. Because I think it's very important, because with the United States, we already saw it happen. We saw it during the Gulf War. There were Patriot systems that were deployed to Israel. We see it all along those years, and for a second, I'm talking only about the ballistic missile defense. We have a lot of other areas of cooperation and preposition. And of course, there is a preposition. There are exercises. There are plans. There are. We are there. If something would happen, I believe that the United States would be alongside Israeli fighting against Iran.
By the way, contingency planning is usually secret, but if you want to enhance your deterrence, maybe you should disclose some of it.
Well, the idea that there is such a plan, the idea that the U.S. forces are coming to Israel, are being deployed into Israel during a contingency time. It's not a secret. It's out of the open. They come here for every 2 years for a huge exercise. We're talking about thousands of U.S. Troops, boots on the ground here in Israel, deploying Patriots, a THAAD system.
That's
Aegis
Juniper
systems.
Cobra or Steel Challenge.
This is Juniper Cobra, this is Juniper Falcon, which is also part of those exercises. So there is a huge amount of cooperation between Israel and the United States on those areas, and again, on others area, and also in other areas. And we see it now from the movement between EUCOM to CENTCOM. It's even enhanced our intelligence capabilities, and there are a lot of other things that we could gain from it. Going back to your question about NATO and from the Israeli pure military point of view, I think that Iran basically really said it all. And I fully agree with what was said by Iran. I think that, from Israel military point of view, it's good to have exercises with NATO. It's good to fly, let's say, if I'm talking from the Israeli Air Force point of view, to fly in a different terrains. You could exercise yourself. Both sides could benefit. But, not only from the military point of view, from, as you said before, the public point of view, I really find it very hard to see the Israeli mother feeling, I would say, openly would like, or the Israeli...
Why? Everyone wants to go abroad.
Yeah, but I really don't see the consent there that the Israeli soldiers would be part of conflicts out of Israel. And by the way, you know what? We have enough challenges here in Israel for our militaries, and we need them here.
So we reached the final four minutes, and therefore each of you has only 1 minute. And the question is, if the war between Russia and Ukraine goes on, apparently Russia's resources would be diverted there, but the diplomatic outcome would not be in doubt. It would only be a very slow and devastating grind. What's the best outcome of the war right now? Danny?
I think the best is for the, first of all, for all the violence and the skirmishes to stop on where they are. And secondly, to start diplomatic negotiations in seriousness to come out to some kind of a solution. I think that at the end of the day, Ukraine will have to give something for the Russians to completely leave Ukraine altogether and commitments not to invade again.
Leave eastern Ukraine, the Russified districts, is that a realistic outcome?
Depends right now on Zelensky, and he has shown great capabilities of influencing his people. So I think he can rationalize it is as in Donbass anyway. You have so many Russians there that it's a headache for the Ukrainians anyway.
I would use my minute to fully disagree with the two gentlemen here on Israel's posture vis-a-vis NATO and future alliances. And because we don't have enough time, I would suggest that what we need now, given the immense change in the geopolitical environment, we need a two-tier approach. The first would be, yes, to find an arrangement by which we do align fully with NATO and the US vis-a-vis the new challenges which are Russia and China, in this completely new geostrategic alignment, where Israel needs to be on that side, and it hasn't so far, contrary to what we think about ourselves. We are identified not as like-minded, much less than what we should have done. So that's the first tier. And the second should be a completely new regional security architecture, which would be linked to the global one, but would be completely new, and would reflect, again, the new realities and the sidelining overall of the Middle East vis-a-vis Europe and the
By that you mean
Pacific arena.
Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf countries?
Yes.
And a Palestinian entity?
Yes. And Israel, of course, under a new arrangement, unlike what we thought in the past, because the US is not going to play the kind of role that it did. NATO is not going to play the kind of role that it did.
Under a new arrangement and
Yes.
under new management too? That remains to be resolved
Not Israeli
domestically.
management.
Doron
No,
Gavish.
but you said it, you disagree. I still trying to understand what exactly are you disagreeing?
I'm
because
disagreeing
it
with
seems
the
that,
overall approach that
we
Israel
are-
should take vis-a-vis NATO, which should be to try and join it fully. Without reservations.
But
And
now
then-
you've taken
and-
some of his minutes.
No, I gave him the
Yes.
I think that one of the big questions, of course, is what would be the narrative of what happened or what is the outcome of this war, and looking at NATO and talking about opportunity. If we would stop now, I think that the outcome is completely different from what Putin wanted. It is probably different from what a lot of people anticipated. And it is an opportunity to the alliance really to unite, to enforce itself, and to build plans to be even a stronger alliance into the future.
And Lerman, you have a moment, not a minute.
I keep my eye constantly on Beijing. The most significant outcome of this war will be represented by what she has learned from Putin's mistakes.
So this is going to be one of the topics for a future program. We hope to have a representative of the Chinese government as one of our interlocutors here. In the meantime, thank you very much, Eran Lerman, Doron Gavish, Eran Etzion, and Danny Ayalon. And we will be back for a new program of Powers in Play very soon.